Could we start over there and a second one in the corner?
Gideon Rabinovitz from the Centre for Aid and Public Expenditure here at ODI. Just a quick question to Tam and Diana. I mean, Tam was very much focused on the political constraints and how the sort of conflict over political power influences institutions. And obviously that comes into a lot of the institutional confusion and overlapping mandates that you were talking about. How much of the dysfunction is down partly to poor design and an inability to sort of order things right? Because you use the word donors should come in and help rationalise the system. If it's all about if a lot of that is about politics and politics has made it into a dysfunctional system, how easily can they do that? Are you implying that to some degree it's because of more technical issues that can be addressed alongside or separate from trying to untangle some of the political challenges that remain in getting those institutions working better?
I can do. I mean, I think on paper, have we got that over presentation? There's another slide that shows how things should look, and that might help. But on paper, it's all very rational. So by design, you could say the system has been designed quite well. I mean, it's probably been designed quite off the shelf, as a lot of other decentralized systems were. But the law on paper, it works quite well. The next one down, that slide, yeah. So this is how
the next one.
This is how the local councils should look. Okay. These very neat lines. So, I mean, there's two stages. If you wanted to really know what was happening, more than the research that we did, there is some sort of functional review that needs to happen just to know what's happening. I mean, before you can say what might happen next, you need to know what's happening. And what they'll find is that it doesn't look like this at all. It looks more like these kind of diagrams that we've been showing.
That's more a diagram showing how informally things.
Yeah, so this is formally how it should, and that's informally. Yeah. But the second question is, okay, even if you did that review and you looked at how things might work, what we're hoping to suggest is, because of the political settlement, it's unlikely that's going to be implemented anyway. So you can have your nice technical plan. There have been nice technical plans in the past, but the political settlement hasn't really changed after this election. And the likelihood that the new president is going to push forward decentralisation, even if you do these functional reviews, is unlikely. But it's still a necessary step. I mean, you can't do the institutional reform without doing that. So it is still a necessary step in that process. But we'd like to flag up that actually, is it likely that democratic decentralisation is going to be pushed ahead of? Is fiscal decentralisation going to happen? Is decision making really going to be pushed down to that level rather than staying in the sector ministries? And I think the answer is no.
Can I just add to that? Currently, I understand that there's a donor out there trying to do some public sector reform, and they've got a 100-day project. So they're going to fix Malawi's civil service in 100 days. So if a donor goes in with that kind of mentality without understanding the politics behind this and dealing with the politics of this, then they'll never get it. It won't work. You can't do this. Is not just a technical fix, but you know that. You work here.
Great, thank you. We'll take 2 more questions, maybe at one go. There's one over there.
Thank you, Sheila Page, ODI. One general, then something quite specific. I wasn't sure why you all assumed that decentralization was feasible, desirable, or should be on the agenda at all. And I wasn't sure at all what Diana meant by decentralization, because I can't see that having accountability upward and common standards has anything whatsoever to do with decentralization. Decentralization implies you trust the decentralized authority to set its own standards to be accountable to itself. So there really seems to be a real contradiction at the heart of what you're saying. And in a country the size of Malawi, which is not China, the idea of decentralization has always seemed to me more than a little absurd. The refusal to delegate, which a couple of you talked about, the politicization of the whole process, does seem to strike me as meaning that this whole discussion is about whether or not one should force all Malawian pigs to fly. But the other question is on the specifics of the accountability. I mean, the structure which you described, Diana, of effectively matrix reporting one direction for function and the other for region, is something any multinational has. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. They always are revising it. But in itself, there's nothing odd about it. And accountants should never, never, never be part of the sector of organization to which they are accounting. So, I mean, there was a lot of contradiction in there. You said that you seem to consider it odd that the accountants were in a separate structure. They have to be. That's what accountants and auditors are for. And on several of the points, I wasn't sure why there was no comparison with any other country. I mean, the complaints, the fact that patients won't complain is something which one hears every day in this country. The fact that local councillors aren't well informed is something, again, one has heard before. So there's a bit of an assumption that Malawi system is somehow special, which I didn't understand.
We're going to take another 2 questions on the floor and one from Wezi Mwangibule online.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I've got 2 questions. One is relating to the civil service in the country. I think one of the things that we have seen since the advent of multipartism in Malawi is weaker and weaker public service. And one of the contributing factor to that is the fact that there is politicization of the public service. So every time a new government comes in, it appoints new technocrats at different levels. Now, because of that, it has led to a weaker institution, and therefore it has affected delivery of service in general. To what extent did you see that connected in your research with the local government side of things? The other point I wanted to raise is the question of the civil society or the pressure groups, as Edge has mentioned. In your research, did you get a sense that these civil society organizations, who would be speaking on behalf of the illiterate, the poor people in the villages, did you get a sense that they are aware of the implication of having councillors? Because I think what I see happening is that we have now another layer of bureaucracy, another layer where impact. Nobody has ever thought about the impact of having councillors and what change would they bring. Are our pressure groups in Malawi aware of what this entails? And is there a role to speak up and pressurize government to look at, for example, the issue of completing the whole process of decentralization, relooking at the legal framework and ensuring that issues of accountability are properly factored in? Thank you.
Thank you. Gareth Wall from the Commonwealth Local Government Forum. I was just, the first one just on political settlements. I was just interested conceptually whether HAC's idea of it includes the donors as an elite and informing the political settlement. It seems silly to think that it's just the national players and there's no international elites involved in creating what's going on in Malawi. But the other ones, particularly to Diane and Edge, on what now that we have local councillors in place, do you think a few key priority activities would be? They could be on the reform side. What are the key reforms you think the local councillors should be lobbying for to help if they were going to have 2 or 3 key areas? You mentioned a few, be it in terms of the role of chiefs on councils or the ability to hire and fire at the council level. What do you think, having looked at the system, are the key priorities that might help the system? And what role is there for the councillors in terms of any organisation of mayors, be it the local government association, to both support those sort of lobbying activities, but also to build in the capacities of the councillors and the knowledge gaps? Thanks.
And I just want to quickly add a question from Wezi Mwangilube, who's joined us online. The question is for Professor Edge Kanyongolo. So you've acknowledged that local councillors won't make a difference. What are the solutions, or are there any mechanisms in place for local citizens without a voice to learn of the accountability process? So could we start off with our panel in London commenting on some of the questions, and then we'll have Edge quickly comment on the final question from Wezi.
want to pick up? The first point from Sheila, I'm glad you've brought it up actually, because it's not to suggest that normatively we think that decentralisation is the answer in Malawi at all. I mean, what we were set out to do is to find out how local government was working, and what we found was that there's a formal commitment to decentralisation and been partial decentralisation, and there's never been a change in policy. I mean, the government has never meaningfully decentralised, so why still have a national decentralisation policy? And I think one of the main recommendations from the report was actually to say, well, what you might want to say is what might work better is to strengthen the central ministries and strengthen just, you know, administrative functions at local level and not try to decentralise any further. Maybe in the cities because they have a local revenue base, you know, there's a different staff base there. But in the rural areas, really, is democratic centralisation the answer? So, yeah, absolutely. And I think on this, I think Diana's, the point was that the local accountants are appointed by the Accountant General. The DC is the controlling officer and so should really have oversight of them.
But they're actually integrating them into the
oversight
system.
over the well, he has to sign off on. He has to sign off on their checks, on their processes. So we mean oversight on the day-to-day running of the office, he's the controlling officer, the DC. So he needs to have some sort of oversight over the accountants.
This is different than the audit function, which is done by the National Audit Office. But at the moment, they're into.
The whole matrix structure is a perfectly normal one.
Well, that may be.
And it may not be a good one for Malawi,
but I think
there's nothing abnormal or odd about it.
But I think that goes on to a last point, Sheila. You know, is it any different? And the difference is you may have quite confusing structures elsewhere, but you also have quite good coordination or oversight or institutions work that pick things up if things go wrong. So it's not that you can't have multiple reporting structures, but if you do, there's even more need for coordination if you are going to have multiple reporting structures, and that just isn't happening. I don't know, do you...
Go ahead.
No, No, I think I'll leave. There was pressure groups, maybe. I don't know.
Yes.
I don't want to dominate.
Is there anything we
perhaps
want?
could I come in now?
Yes, you may, with the question from Wezi on local citizens.
I wanted to. Yes, I wanted to combine that with a question on civil society. I think there was a question of whether civil society is aware. I think that it varies, the level, because civil society is such an all-encompassing term. Others are more aware than others. But I think underneath that is a broader question of whether the transition from the ad hoc, pragmatic situation we had to elected councillors has been handled systematically, and I don't think it has. So in terms of civil society, for example, they were an active participant in what was mentioned earlier as one of the ad hoc structures, which is the District Executive Committee and District Consultative Forum. They played a very active role in those fora, at least in the districts in which we did research. The question is, have they been prepared for the new reality? Not only the civil society organization, the DCF, but also the other players within that structure. So I think it raises the broader question of the transition, even among the citizens themselves. The other question, I think, is a little more difficult. What are citizens to do if local government will not deliver effectively? Well, I think is to, as it were, to make do with the realities and the rather, perhaps the messy combination of institutions that have performed this function in the absence of local government councillors for the past 2 decades or so. I think that it's likely that, particularly in rural areas, I think traditional authorities will play an increasing role as the center around which the community rallies. So if they want to make demands, if they want to make complaints, that's likely to be the channel. But this is not in a fossilized form. I think it will take new forms, hybrid forms. I think this has been written about in the Town Chief's paper. I think civil society, NGOs will continue to play the role. I think in the presentation on health, I think they were mentioned a number of times, but of course, unless the challenges they face are addressed, they too will not fill the gap satisfactorily. So where does that leave the, as it were, the voiceless citizen or the citizen who we had this optimism about local government and is now faced with this reality, in my view, that they are unlikely to work in the short term? I am not very optimistic. I think that chances are that they are unlikely to move out of the challenging living conditions. But of course, all this we are not discussing in a vacuum. There is central government as well. A lot of what happens in parliament, what happens in the presidency, in ministries, is something we haven't tackled. And I think that will also have an impact. So if you have a functional central government, who knows? Maybe the citizen may find that local government is in fact redundant. But I mean, a lot of this is speculative. Thank you.
Thank you, Edge. And Andrew, do you have something you'd quickly like to add?
Just quickly, in terms of, there was talk about information, and at least in the health sector, what we learned was there was a lot of information that was reaching the communities, but this was a lot to do with preventative messages and treatment, and little about rights. So messages about rights were not as effectively being cascaded downwards. So, but having said this, as part of research, what was clear was that people knew what a good treatment was and what they had to expect from this good treatment, and they knew if they were not receiving it. And just to add to this, in terms of civil society roots and the role of local government, I mean, what we felt, at least in the health sector, was that the local government and the election of the local councillors was an additional lever in this sort of accountability process. There are many different routes, and we felt that this, maybe the improvements in this improves that particular lever, but there are many other things that need to be rectified, especially in relation to management of the services themselves, and that was a lot more about the organisation itself. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question?
Can I answer his question there?
Sure.
Were you asking, what should donors do? Or what
you were quite explicit to some degree on what you thought donors.
Well, one of the things
I was particularly in terms of what support for local councils themselves and what
let me address that, because Edge mentioned that there's like 3-day seminar, and one of the things that we had recommended in our report was long-term, not just improvement of the capacity of the councillors, but everybody, so that the DC knew what now his new role was. Because, can you change to that other? You'll see how it's supposed to work. Is these health committee? See if you have health committee there. The district health officer is the technical person. The health committee is going to be run by the councillor. So there'll be a councillor for health, a councillor for education, and those people are going to have to be able to read a spreadsheet, to write a budget, to do the planning, to do the whole thing. And these are people who often have, maybe 10th grade education. So if we're lucky, so everybody needs to be skilled up in how to run this. There's also a need for infrastructure. These people don't have computers, they don't have roofs over their head, they don't have desks, they don't have any of that. So there's those sorts of basic things. But one of the things that David Booth in this place has written about is arm's length aid, which is basically, and we met a few agencies out in Malawi that were doing this. You don't bring money to the problem. The problem is how to raise capacity, how to teach this stuff, without bringing budgets and throwing money at the problem, but long-term technical assistance down at the local level, working in the councils with people to get these functions working. If you're going to do, as Tam defended us with Sheila, I don't think decentralization's the answer, but nobody in Malawi is willing to hear that, from donors down to the local people, because they believe that the councillors are going to come in and bring them development. That's what they'll tell you. So I would start with long-term sort of technical assistance at that level, plus the things that Edge talked about, the legal reforms so there's a review. And one of the things that we were quite interested in when we met, like the CEO of Blantyre, and he's saying, I have a city of whatever it is, 1 million people, but I can't run the city. He doesn't have a revenue base. He doesn't have these mixed authorities. He has all these problems. He gets like, well, I can't remember, 70% of his revenue he can't collect because people refuse to pay it, but it takes him 3 years to go to court to get anybody to pay him. To pay this, if you're going to run a modern city, you need to have the authority and the capacity to do a modern city. So what we would recommend would be asymmetric decentralization. Decentralize the cities and get those functioning to do the job, because Malawi is the second fastest urbanizing country in Africa. And in 20 or 30 years, this is going to be a real mess if they don't get a handle on running their cities. So that's where I would start.
Thank you very much. I'd like to bring the event to a close. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to everyone that came in today, as well as our audience that joined us online. Just want to remind everyone that an audio and video recording of the event will be available online within 48 hours, as well as PDFs of the PowerPoint presentations you've seen today. Thank you all very much.